Welcome to an episode of the newly minted Spunky Pro podcast. My name is Karina. I am your host. If you were a follower of my previous podcast, The Landlord Chick, welcome to the video version of me. If you're not following my Instagram, this is what I look like. Hooray! Okay, now that's out of the way. Guys, we're hitting the ground running with what's probably going to be possibly a controversial issue. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, honestly, but it's more because I've been curious about why exactly this has existed. So we're going to be talking about rent control and rent stabilization, as well as maybe touching briefly maybe on rent freezes. Why do I want to talk about this? Well, I'm curious about it. Like, obviously, most of us know that New York City has had rent control, rent stabilization for, decades. And I was going to be curious as to why that actually started. So when I started learning about it more, I'm like, oh, you know what? This is a good conversation for a podcast because I'm learning more about maybe some gaps that are existing in the program and the legislation. This is a really good learning point for all of us that are outside of New York and particularly states that I think are entertaining the idea of starting rent control or adopting some fashion of it. But first, to know why we have it in New York City, we kind of need to go back into history because we want to be able to understand this from the start to finish. So we got to go all the way back to World War II, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was president. So after World War II, we have a situation in New York where you have a large sort of discrepancy between housing because we have a lot of rentals which are built pre 1947, which are under some leftover rent control, rent stabilization efforts during the war. Then you have these buildings that are being built new, and this is particularly in the 1960s. You have a lot of buildings that are being built brand new in the 1960s. This is an era where we love to tear stuff down that was old and build new stuff. And those were not subject to the rent stabilization programs that were in place from World War II. So you happen to have a situation where you have these pre-World War II buildings, which are on a rent stabilization program. They're relatively low. But then you also have these properties which are being built newer. They aren't subject to those. And on top of it, you have a vacancy rate in New York City, which is very, very low post World War II. We're talking about an occupancy rate that probably dropped to 1% for the entire city for a fair amount of time. Now, just for perspective, economists normally consider a 5% vacancy rate in a city to be healthy. Why is that healthy? Because, well, it helps make sure that the market kind of keeps itself in check. You don't necessarily have people that are taking full advantage of the fact that there's a high demand for this product. And then you're also getting sort of this turnover where you have a revitalization through people moving to different parts of the city, maybe moving into the city, other people moving out of the city. So generally, economists want to see a city have a 5% vacancy rate. Well, here's New York City sitting with 1%. You can kind of see how we've got a problem occurring. So, what does New York City do to address this problem? Well, they start introducing rent control. So, as legislative pressure grows to address this problem and they're being outpaced for growth, they're like, whoa, we've got to do something about it. So, City Hall decides to intervene and they create free market stabilization cost measures. Now, I'm not really going to get into a lot of the nitty gritty about the legislation and everything like that. I wanted to give you guys just an understanding of where exactly this started in New York City. So that's where we're starting from. And my chair is turning. Guys, I'm sorry. I can't control that. I don't know why it's doing that right now. But so that's why we end in this situation where we have rent control in New York City. And that's a very brief history. If you want other histories of it, you can go over to like Reason TV on YouTube. They have a great video which covers the history of rent control. So why are we here now and what are the problems with it? Well, we still have rent control in New York City. Spoiler, we knew that. But there's huge problems with their original programs. And I'm going to point out some of them right now. So for starters, there were never any income limits on rent control. So if a building was designated as being rent controlled, if you moved into it, it didn't matter if you made, $3 an hour or $10 an hour, obviously going back in time a little bit, your rent was frozen for the duration that you were there, regardless of how your rent shifted. So you could have somebody moving into a building who makes, let's say, $70,000, but yet they're living in a rent controlled building, which maybe realistically the rent is more more in line with what somebody who makes like 43,000 would make. That's that's a problem. The other problem with the system is that it passed along to generations and there was no year time limit on it. So think about it this way. If you moved into an apartment, any apartment anywhere in the world, pick even your favorite city in the entire world or your least favorite city in the entire world to make this a really great analogy. If you moved into an apartment and the rent when you moved in was $650 and it was never going to change, would you ever really move out of that apartment? Realistically, would you? Especially when you knew everything around you was getting infinitely more expensive outside of that city, even. You're not going to move. You're going to stay there for as long as you possibly can. And with the way sometimes, and this might depend on leases and whatnot, but if you can hold on to an apartment and let's say you're going to go take a job somewhere else for a few years, you can sublease it to somebody else. They'll pay that rent. And then when you come back to live there again after you're done working in, let's say, South Carolina, you come back to live in New York City, that person moves because you're still the person of record, the tenant of record, you're still going to pay that amount of $650. You could live in the same apartment for 20 years and pay $650 in rent because there are no year limits on this rent control. There's also not any generational limits. Now that's important to remember too, because if you've watched Friends at all, or a little bit about sort of the backstory of it, Monica has a really sweet apartment because it was her grandmother's apartment and it was rent controlled. So, I mean, realistically, we all kind of looked at that apartment like, yeah, okay, that would be seriously expensive anywhere. But the real kicker of that story is that that's kind of true. Like there's a lot of people in like Monica's situation where their grandmother, their grandparents got an apartment under rent control. And because they could pass it down to different generations, that's exactly what happened. So you have a situation where Monica's apartment, realistically, even in the Friends era of like the mid 90s, should have been renting out for like probably around $1,500, $1,600 a month. She was paying probably an insane amount of like, I forget if the show ever mentioned it, but let's say she was probably only paying like $600. I mean, holy cow. So that's the other issue with it, is that there's no generational limits on it. Now, another thing that's kind of a problem, and this I think is the easiest one to fix, is that rent stabilization and rent control, they actually don't have adjustments for inflation. So as inflation goes up, they still don't have the ability to go into, let's say, Monica's apartment and raise the rent from $600 to like, let's say $625, just based on any sort of like standard inflation rate, like what the US government says is the inflation rate. They can't do that. They're stuck at 600 still. So that's why we have some huge issues with rent control. Now, I'm not trying to demonize it right off the bat. I'm certainly not, because number one, I've never lived in New York City. I've never lived in New York City. I don't know if either one of those is ever going to come true, nor do I necessarily want it to come true. I'll say that. I'm not necessarily a big city girl. But you can see sort of the problems with this initial system that was set up. So even if you want to believe, again, my chair moved here. Let's say we want to believe altruistically that rent control can be a good thing. We already see immediate issues with the way it is set up. We've got the fact that you cannot raise the rent despite inflation. We've got the fact that it can pass along to generations. There's no income limits on it. And then there's no year time frame like, oh, it's going to be rent controlled for you, but it's only going to be rent controlled for 5 years. And then we're going to adjust the rate again. If you think about it, if you buy a home or a property and you happen to get an adjustable rate mortgage, so something that changes year to year or can change at certain intervals, you don't have the ability to say, well, yeah, you know what, I don't want it this time. And if we look at ARMs, the reason that rate is adjusted is based on, national interest rates. That's a little bit of a divergent path there, but hang with me here. Circling back to rent control, that kind of helps solidify even furthermore why we have issues with rent control, because a lot of commercial properties, you'll end up buying them on an adjustable rate mortgage. So your interest rate can be adjusted on your mortgage based on interest rates set by the federal government, but at the same time, you can't do anything to change the rents in your unit. That's a problem. So while this might have been good in theory or a good start to something, unfortunately, the way it's failed to be adapted and kind of obvious reasons has created a large disparity here between the purpose, the execution, and then the end result. Because now we get to the end result portion of this, and it's creating stress on landlords. Because if you own a building and you can only charge $600 to all of your tenants for the duration of how long you own it, it's going to put you in a position where, especially if you're a small landlord, you're unable to fix the units, especially after vacancy. So if you have a brownstone, let's say, so brownstones are those typical, like stereotypical, like Sex in the City, like I think even though it wasn't set in New York City, you think of like the Cosby Show, the exterior of their home, that's also a brownstone. So you look at typical brownstone, you've got 2 to 3, 4 units in there. If that's rent controlled and you have a tenant move out and they've lived there for 10 years, let's say, you want to get it realistically as an investor. Our normal ideas are to get it up to snuff for what the market wants it to look like. We're going to replace the countertops. We're going to make, the paint better. We're going to change out the flooring. We're going to update the bathroom. We're going to do all these things because that's what we want to do to improve the value of our property as far as its fixtures and its amenities. But yet, because of rent control and having that person only paid $600 each month for 10 years, you go to your bank account to pay for it, and you don't have the funds to make those big upgrades. So you're not making those big upgrades. Then this also kind of creates a situation where it's hard for landlords even to pay for your normal repairs. So let's go to an instance of a building which the heating system goes down. This is honestly a very common thing in New York City where you have this battle between rent control and then like getting the heat running and fixing it. Because rent control is saying this is the amount of rent you're collecting the entire time this person's here. You can't do anything about it. But then your heating system is saying, I'm getting really old. I need to be repaired. I need to be replaced. But you're not going to be able to meet in the middle because you're not going to have the funds to take care of that. So then as a result of that, you hear a lot of stories about New York City landlords who maybe don't have heat running to some units, or the heat doesn't work very well, or they don't have any heat at all. And of course, it creates this whole different situation. Now, I'm not advocating for tenants going without heat. Understand me? I'm not. I'm just laying out the facts here that this is how these things are kind of created. This is also, and then this also is creating a larger vacancy problem. Why is it creating a larger vacancy problem? Well, because if you're told you can only collect a certain amount of rent, and finally somebody maybe dies, they don't have anybody to take over their rent control department in a generational thing, or they just move out and, don't really care about trying to pass along the deal to somebody else. You go into this unit, this person's lived there for 10 years, 15 years, their family's lived there for 30 years. Do you think you're going to have the money to even do a basic upgrade to that to make it where a person would generally want to move in there? You're really not going to have the money. You're not, because you weren't able to charge market rate. So while you have to pay market rate for your services and for your products that you're going to put into that unit, leading up to this occurrence, you haven't been able to charge anything near market rent. So what happens then is you have particularly smaller landlords who have maybe a 6-unit building, and when somebody moves out, they don't bother repairing it. There's a lot of videos on YouTube from sort of your independent YouTube reporters, I like to call them, where they're investigating this in New York City, and they'll interview landlords and they'll go through their buildings or the tenants, and they'll say, yeah, in this building, we have 8 units, but this unit's been vacant since, 2000. This one's been vacant since 2010 because the landlord doesn't have the money to fix it up because it's a rent controlled building. This is truth, guys. This is 100% truth. So we have a situation where we are creating landlords who cannot pay for their repairs. They cannot pay to upgrade their units. And then because they're not paying to upgrade their units and they're just sitting there, then we're actually increasing the problem with housing because you're creating more of a housing shortage, because you have a lot of units that are vacant, but they can't be fixed up because they can't afford to be paid for by the landlords that were collecting the rent. Well, this is getting like crazily out of control when you begin to think about it. So if they can't raise the rents, they're not repairing their units. They're not repairing their units, then suddenly we get into a housing shortage again in New York City. whoa, we've created our own problem again, like what, 30, 40 years later. It's crazy. It's absolutely mind-blowing and crazy. Now, what will happen? What is likely going to happen if this continues on its current trajectory? Well, what you're going to see is you're going to see the smaller landlords selling their properties. And the ones that are going to come in to buy them, the ones that can come in and afford to buy them and maintain them properly, are going to be larger conglomerates that operate mostly outside of New York City, because they're going to need to get the income from somewhere else to be able to maintain these properties in New York City. So you can get a very large Capital Industries LLC that's going to come in and they're going to start buying all these buildings in New York City. But that's going to be part of their larger portfolio, which has properties in Phoenix, in Dallas, in Milwaukee. I'm just naming cities here. And that's how they're going to be able to pay for maintaining those properties. They're going to own those properties strictly for the tax write-offs. Because those buildings are going to be losses, it's going to help them with their overall tax situation when it comes to filing their taxes. So then basically what we've done is we have started to exterminate these small mom and pop landlords in New York City. We've transferred the majority of ownership over to larger conglomerates who will treat tenants like numbers and things, because these will be people making decisions who literally have never met Maria, who rents apartment number 3, or John, who rents apartment number 6. They will have never met them. They likely will have never talked to them. So we're going to be introducing this very impersonal landlord-tenant situation, which, guys, never ends well. I've said it before. I'll say it again. We have a very personal relationship with our tenants, and it kind of needs to stay that way because we are a huge part of their life. We are where they live. We are the biggest portion of their life between where they pay their money and basically in correlation to how they spend their time. So we want personal, to a certain extent, personal relationships with the tenants. With the conglomerates coming in to swallow up these buildings, you're going to lose that personal tenant connection. And then that's when you run into situations where you have heartless and honestly unethical, bordering unethical situations with rental properties occurring. This is bad. This is really bad. So how do we fix this? Well, going back to what we talked about before, I see 2 kind of easy fixes. The first one is you put in place income limits. You want to make sure that the people who perhaps are the ones that are serving the food at restaurants, making the food at restaurants, the ones that are working the gift shops in New York City, you want to make sure that those people have a place to rent just as much as the white collar software executive. Okay, so what do you do to address that? You introduce an income limit then. Introduce an income limit to rent control, rent stabilization, whichever program. Because technically, I think they're both still in fact in New York City. Another option is to limit just the number of years that rent can be in place. That rent can be in place for 3 years, then it's adjusted for inflation, and it's locked in for another 3 years. So kind of like sometimes you get a mortgage where you lock in the interest rate for certain years, certain amount of time. That's what could be done with rent control. You can lock it in. Third option, and I think this would be one of the more obvious ones, is to end the generational loophole where grandma can pass it to daughter, daughter can pass it to daughter, or grandmother can pass it to Monica, granddaughter. That's another, I think, relatively easy solution to this. Now, is any of that going to be popular? No, of course not. So it requires somebody with kind of a large amount of cojones to go in there and say, we have to change this system because the future does not look bright for New York City rentals in general if we continue down this path. So we're going to make a hard decision here. Somebody's have to take the blame for it. Maybe somebody who's only in office for 4 years. I don't really know. But somebody's have to take the blame for it and go, we're going to pass a piece of legislation in New York City that ends the generational loophole for rent control. And it also allows for adjustments for inflation every 2 years, every 3 years. Because if you're adjusting it every 3 years, that's not to say you go back and you say, for each year you're adjusting it. No, it's like it's locked in for 3 years. Then at that point, whatever the inflation rate is, you're going to change it again. So it was 600 for 3 years. Now the inflation rate, I'm going to try and just make this easy math for myself. Inflation rate is 10%. I know I don't know if that's realistic or not, probably not, but it's 10%. So now the apartment's going to be 660 for the next 3 years. Something along those lines. But there's got to be some sort of change somewhere, or else I don't see this getting any better for New York City in the long term. Because all these problems are going to exist where you've got small landlords who can't afford to fix the units when they become vacant, creating a shortage. You have landlords who can't afford to make the bigger repairs to the units, like the roofs and then the heating systems. And then you see stories about New York City landlords being slum landlords. I don't really think the vast majority of New York City landlords are setting out to be slumlords. I think they're just caught in like this Chinese finger trap that they can't get out of because they don't have the funds to maintain their buildings properly. Okay. So I really think it needs to be adjusted in New York City. Any cities or states that are looking at adopting this, I really hope they consider some of the flaws that exist in the New York City system and go, it was great in theory, but now that we're going to introduce it, we need to make adjustments to it. We need to make sure we aren't creating the same mistakes that they are. So we're going to pay attention to this and we're going to adapt how we're going to implement this. You might even be listening to this and arguing that we shouldn't even have rent control. Okay, fine. I'm not really here to make that argument with New York City because, like I said, I have zero interest or zero ponies in the race, even. So I'm really not here to pass judgment on that. But I do think as landlords, we all need to be aware of sometimes why rent control was created, but then also what are some of the inherent problems of rent control. And if we want to have a compromise occur, because sometimes we have to negotiate with those making our laws as we begin to advocate for our rights, what are some ways that we can maybe approach our lawmakers and say, you know what, we understand you really feel the need for rent control, rent stabilization. We can't apparently change your minds. So let's talk about having an income limit. Let's talk about having let's talk about closing the generational loophole. Educate yourself so that when this comes up, you can have these conversations with your legislators or your city town officials, your city hall officials, so you can maybe come up with a compromise or even maybe educate them on what some of the downfalls of this are. Again, guys, I am not like the all-knowing person on this. I highly suggest you go over to Reason TV and watch their video on New York City rent control. It was a very enlightening read, and I feel even if you are someone who believes in rent control, I think you can watch that video and kind of learn a lot about sort of the unintentional consequences of rent control, and you can see how maybe that program can be improved. All right, first video episode of the year done, in the books. I know I've got some things to work on, guys. We got to work on my chair not moving during the recording. I also know I probably have to work on like my light situation here. I have the window here, and then I have natural light. I'm sorry, natural light that way, artificial light coming from that way. And I have to clean up my room just a little bit more, but you see my bookshelves in the back, which I just actually reorganized over my little winter break. So I actually got those all set up because before I had just stacks of books on the floor. Biographies,